Hey everybody, Mr. Larson here. So far we've talked about in this class the simple idea of Mendelian genetics, where you have one allele coming down from your parents, from each parent, basically creates the traits that you have. But there are sometimes things that are more complex than that. So it's not always that cut and dry. You get one for your mom, one for your dad. Each trait sort of has, not each trait, but most traits actually have a more complex way of creating themselves, and we're going to investigate that here today. So there's such thing as polygenic inheritance, where you have multiple genes that affect a single trait. Instead of just having one gene to one trait, you have multiple genes coming together to influence a single trait. There's also pleiotropy, which is the exact opposite, where you have one gene in your chromosome that affects multiple different traits. So this again is a different take on how genes can influence your physical characteristics. This is another example of genetic complexity, where you have multiple genes affecting multiple different traits, each one influencing a different one. So you have gene A doing these three, gene B influencing these four. So basically, it's just a whole lot of variety that's occurring in your body. So not all the time is it one gene for one trait. You have this sort of genetic complexity within your body that affects who or what you look like. So basically, just a summary of that. The results of the complexity leads to what is called continuous variation, where we have a wide variation of phenotypes, basically meaning different physical characteristics. And here are a couple of examples of those physical characteristics. We have different skin color variations. As you can see here, to kind of the extreme ends of the color scale. So you have very white and then very dark skinned. And then you also have different eye color variations. So you may have a different color or very similar color to these. You can vary from blue to green to brown to hazel. Every single person has a different variation of eye color. There's also height variation. Here you have Yao Ming, who's over 7 foot. Here's Peter Dinklage, the actor from Game of Thrones, who I believe is under 5 feet, closer to 4. So here is another example of that height variation. So now we're going to look into basically what happens with these genetic disorders. So there are those that are called recessively inherited disorders. So these are phenotypes that are only expressed if you have recessive homozygotes within your genetic material. Basically, that just means you have two recessive letters coming down from your parents. So both your parents gave you that recessive allele. So what this kind of deals with is this idea of carriers. So carriers are individuals that carry the recessive allele but don't show the trait. So basically meaning they are heterozygous in their for that trait, where they have one large letter or one little letter. The example here for a trait would be a capital letter and a lowercase letter. So basically that means that they aren't showing those symptoms. They don't show the trait, but they can eventually pass on that gene, that trait to their offspring. So this could cause issues with the different genetic disorders, which we'll investigate here in a little bit. So these different recessively inherited disorders can either be autosomal or sex-linked, meaning that they can either be in the autosomes, which is those 22 other chromosomes that contain all your genetic material, or it could be sex-linked, where it's in your sex-linked chromosomes, your X and your Y chromosomes. So once again, sex-linked. What does it mean for something to be sex-linked? It is found in your X or Y chromosomes. Many disorders are found on the X chromosome, or is known as an X-linked gene, such as red-green color blindness, while very few are actually found on the Y chromosome. So since most of our disorders are found on the X chromosome, what does that mean for inheritance? So it actually means that your parents play a pivotal role in what basically is passed down to you. Here you have a Mendelian chart, showing the different genetic makeup that for different offspring for red-green color blindness. So here you have your males, your squares are your males, your circles are your females. Shaded means they are affected. Unshaded means they are unaffected, so you have 2 here that are unaffected. And then color blindness is basically a recessive trait, meaning if you have the recessive allele, you will be red-green colorblind. So here it kind of shows an example of a male who is not colorblind, so they are unaffected, and a female who is a carrier. So how we know she is a carrier is by the circle as well as looking at the genotype. So here it kind of has the half and half, shaded, half unshaded, basically meaning she is a character or carrier. Here you see the one X chromosome has the dominant allele, one X chromosome has the recessive allele. So when we do our chart, one of these X chromosomes is going to go to this half. The other X chromosome with the recessive allele is going to go to this half. So when we finish up our chart here, you're going to have 2 possibilities of offspring that aren't affected at all, aren't carriers, don't have the gene, are going to be completely healthy. And then you have another half of them that can either be affected or could be carriers. So once again, one X chromosome is coming from the mother, and the other X chromosome is coming from the father. The recessive chromosome can go to this child, and then the Y chromosome goes to this child. So basically just showing that carriers can have the possibility of passing on the trait to the next generation. It's about a 50-50 chance of passing it on to the next generation. So X-linked alleles are always expressed in males because males only have that one singular chromosome. So basically, males are more likely to have sex-linked genetic disorders than females. So kind of the example here, going back to this chart, when we're looking at this male here in the bottom right corner, he has the red-green color blindness trait because it was passed on from the mother's X chromosome, while they got their Y chromosome from the father. So just kind of showing that the males have a higher percentage chance of getting that trait than females do, because females in this scenario can only either be unaffected or can only be carriers. So how do we know what happens moving forward, or how can we tell whether or not somebody is a carrier or somebody is affected, or how a family looks with a certain genetic disorder? This is what is called pedigrees. So pedigrees are a chart that are used to show relationships, inheritance throughout a family. So you can either look at dominant or recessive traits, you can look at autosomal traits, you can look at sex-linked traits. All of these can be shown through pedigrees. So what they look like is something like this. So we're going to be doing a practice here in a little bit later on in this digital lesson. But this is what a pedigree looks like. So here you have the very first generation. Here you have your carriers, because it is half shaded. That's how we know it's a carrier. And then this is an unaffected person, unaffected male. And then you just look at the different generations. So as we go down, this is the second generation here, and then they have offspring, and it goes to the third generation here. So pedigrees are used by doctors. They're used by different medical professionals in order to look at the history of a certain genetic disorder within a family. So if you ever go to the doctor, they may ask you or whoever they're kind of visiting with, do you have a family history of this genetic disorder? And that is basically a way for them to create a pedigree for your family in order to understand how you are going to be affected, how your family is affected, and how the next generation could be affected. So pedigree is a really great tool for medical professionals in order to study how a family can be affected by a certain genetic disorder or a certain genetic trait, depending on what they are looking at. So basically, how can a single mutation cause a disease? Just because we've looked at different genetic disorders, but how sort of does this happen? And how do kind of these carriers happen? How do these genetic traits basically differ from different people? So first, you have your A step here. A gene mutation leads to the incorrect amino acid sequence. So we've looked at this in past digital lessons. Once you have that incorrect amino acid sequence, the membrane protein, or the protein that amino acid sequence creates, doesn't work correctly. Since that protein doesn't work correctly, it could lead to a whole set of cells completely working incorrectly and can even cause different genetic disorders such as cystic fibrosis. So that is basically how genetic disorders can come along. That is also, we also just looked at how genetic disorders can be passed on from generation to generation, and basically how doctors look at those different genetic materials through pedigrees. So for the rest of this digital lesson, you're going to do some more practice with pedigrees. You're going to do some practice with basically more Mendelian charts. And if you need any help, I am available. And I will see you guys